Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. We finally got the second part of the No Way Home update, and it's jam-packed with upgrades, not only to Doc Ock, Green Goblin, and Electro, but we also have transcendences for Mysterio, Sandman, and Vulture too. Since there are so many characters to cover, I decided to look at the first three, since those are the ones people are likely most excited for. This video is going to be packed with a lot of info for all three characters in both PvE and PvP, so I'm going to try to go as quick as I can so that the video doesn't get too long. If you don't have a lot of time and just want to know right off the bat if these uniforms are worth getting, I would say they are because the damage upgrades for all three characters are really good. Doc Ock and Electro have really great damage increases, and even though Green Goblin didn't get his Awakening or T3, which I suspect he'll probably get in a week or so, his damage is actually really good on his base kit. Predominantly focusing on Electro in this video because he got the most significant upgrade. Green Goblin did get a new uniform, but he didn't get an Awakening or T3 yet, and Doc Ock already had an Awakening, so I'm simply just comparing the old uniform to his new uniform. Besides Electro getting his first uniform, which is a pretty significant upgrade on its own, he also got a new mechanic in the game, which is that the damage accumulation that his third skill is based off of is not damage taken or damage dealt, but instead it's based off the amount of movement or distance that you cover after you activate the third skill. This synergizes pretty well with the rest of his kit, since his fifth skill is a V-pad skill that allows you to move around at least 3 times after you've activated it, as well as the first skill, which immediately jumps you to the other end of whichever way you're facing. Because of the cast time for his skills, and because the majority of his damage is located on his 5th and 4th skill, meaning that you're not going to be layering damage on top of one another, but instead casting them in sequence, you're more than likely going to want to go with something like a CTP of Rage, or most obviously a CTP of Judgment, since all of his skills deal elemental damage. Not only that, but if you're lucky enough to reforge that Judgment, that top proc fills up based on the amount of movement that you do, so it works perfectly with his 5th skill. In addition to this, he also has some nice effects for PvP, which you'll see later on, and include things like a heal on his 3rd skill, iframe ignore on his 5th skill, and 60% penetration to all sources on his 4th skill. Keep in mind that all the testing that I did with Electro is without a damage proc and simply with an obelisk that has lightning damage on it and invincible. Not only that, but I'm testing with minimal build, meaning that my Urus are around level 4 I believe, my type enhancement is around level 4 or 5, and my ISO 8 isn't even awakened. But despite that, you can see just how good Electro's base damage is, since I was able to complete a stage 60 of Thanos in close to 2 minutes, and a stage 99 of Thanos in close to 3 minutes. The funny part is that he's even better in World Boss Ultimate, where the all defense down and element resistance can actually take effect. This is really noticeable because his 5th skill has really high defense down and element resist down, that goes up to, I believe, 75% and goes up by increments of 20%. So every time that you hit the opponent, they'll lose 20% defenses and lightning resistance. In addition to this, because of the way his cooldowns on his skills work, you can basically stay in iframe for the majority of the fight and avoid almost all the damage that the opponent deals. You can see the difference that the defense and element resist down makes, since I'm able to complete this fight in almost a minute, or about a minute faster than the Thanos fight. There are some possible different variations for Electro's rotation currently, but the one that I tested that worked pretty well for me was to use the 3rd skill, cancel that into the 5th skill, and move around when the 5th skill is active, and then once the 5th skill is done, simply go into the 4th skill and repeat this rotation. Ideally, you want to proc somewhere around the middle or the end of the 5th skill so that you can also have the damage proc active on the 4th skill. But if you want to try to squeeze out a little bit more damage accumulation for moving around, you can potentially also do a 3 cancel 1 and then go into your 5th and then go into your 4th. Also, if you want to squeeze the rotation a little bit more, you can potentially also cancel the 5th skill once you see that orb effect start appearing. The fourth skill also provides the next skill with a 30% lightning damage increase, but after I tested it, you don't really want to try and cancel this skill into the fifth skill, since the fourth skill itself does probably the most damage in his kit. Once you awaken the character, you can cancel the sixth skill between the 3 and the 5, and then follow the same rotation. So that would be 3, cancel 6, cancel 5, move around during that skill, and then go into the fourth skill, and then repeat the rotation. As a quick note for the fifth skill, you can move pretty far away from the opponent for the first part of the skill, but for the rest of it, if you move too far away from the opponent, you might lose targeting. Even though losing targeting is usually a bad thing, since you lose out on a lot of damage, sometimes if you're locked into that animation and you're about to take a lot of damage from the opponent, it's nice that you can move far enough away to break the animation and avoid that damage outright. You can see from the previous clip and this one that the awakening obviously helps him like every other character, but I noticed that the awakening skill itself actually doesn't do too much damage compared to the rest of Electro's kit. I'm not really sure why this is, but if I would have to guess, it's because the character is obviously using that Oc awakening animation, and that skill is likely a little bit outdated in terms of its damage compared to some of the most recent characters. But regardless, with the awakening, Electro finishes the Thanos stage about 50 seconds faster, and clears the Cull stage about 25 seconds faster. Keep in mind that I'm clearing the Cull stage in about 40 seconds using a suboptimal build and a suboptimal team, since I'm not using his own damage leadership and 2 supports, but just the standard team that I use for testing. If you want to get an idea of the kind of raw damage that Electro deals, compared to the other characters that I've tested in the past, I would say that he is most closely related with Hawkeye. And that's actually saying a lot, considering that Hawkeye is a powerhouse in PvE. You can see on this stage 9 clear that using Chavez's leadership, not even his own leadership, and no support, I'm able to clear it in under 3 minutes, which is usually a good sign that the character is really good for PvE, considering that I don't have a damage proc. I also did a stage 19 of Electro, so I could compare the results directly with the Hawkeye testing that I did a few weeks ago, and using his leadership and a support as well as the ignore dodge support from Maya's uniform, I was able to complete this stage with about 50 seconds remaining. In comparison, that's about 10 seconds or so slower than Hawkeye, but keep in mind that I could use another damage support to make that time even faster, and also improve his build. As another comparison, I was able to do a stage 24 of Mephisto with Hawkeye with about 30 seconds remaining, whereas for Electro, I was only able to do a stage 19 of Mephisto with close to no time remaining. You might think that this shows the character is worse than Hawkeye, but in reality, Mephisto actually has high element resistance, which is one of the reasons why he struggles a little bit. And like I mentioned in the previous clip, I'm only using one other support because Electro has his own damage leadership. He has the benefit of using 2 supports. The only sad part is that there is no other available support at the time. Hopefully when Green Goblin gets an upgrade, his T3 Awakening, I can add that support in and he should be able to perform much better. Jumping over to Oc, you probably already know how to play the character and are simply wondering whether the new uniform provides enough of a damage increase to warrant its cost. So I obviously tested that out with his old uniform first, and my build is a mighty CTP of destruction with that strike effect going up to 110% additional damage to bosses. I completed the halfway point of the Knull fight in about 1 minute and 30 seconds, but didn't really do the whole fight since the old uniform didn't have healing on it and it made it kind of a challenge to do so. The new uniform is a really steep damage increase for him since I'm able to reach that same halfway point in about 30 seconds, which is 1 minute faster. Keep in mind that in addition to this vastly improved damage, the uniform also provides healing now when you use that 3rd skill, which means playing World Boss Legend is way more feasible with this uniform. If you're wondering how the rotation changes with the new uniform, it's basically the exact same as before. You do the 5th skill, cancel into the 3rd skill, and then go into the 4th skill, which is the one that you would predominantly want to proc on. The one unfortunate part or drawback of this uniform is that the awakening skill for Doc Ock can't be cancelled like all the other Sinister 6 characters can. This means that if you're doing the rotation with the awakening skill, you would have to do 5, cancel 3, cancel 6, and you wouldn't really be using your 4th skill. However, the character is really proc friendly, and if you want to go with a CTP of Rage build for him, you can also do that because he has guaranteed crit rate in his kit. I haven't really tested with that option, so I can't really tell you what the rotation would be, though one thing to keep in mind is that the 4th skill can potentially be delayed cancelled, but because the 3rd skill provides the next skill with a damage increase of 200%, it might be a little bit weird to try and delay cancel a skill because you might lose out on that increased damage proc from the uniform. Anyways, you can see just how great of an upgrade this is, since I'm able to complete stage 19 in about 2 minutes, whereas with the old uniform I only got to the halfway mark in about 1 minute and 30 seconds, meaning that I essentially did 30 more bars of damage in 30 seconds. Since I have a CTP of Destruction on Green Goblin and I obviously can't test in Knull or Mephisto, I decided to take him into a stage 99 of Thanos instead. His old uniform does have some decent damage, but the survival or healing on it isn't really that great, so I only decided to go to that first phase for Thanos, meaning that I got to that 15 health bar mark in about 1 minute and 15 seconds. To give you an idea of just how much of an improvement the new uniform provides, I got to that same health bar mark in about 25 seconds. At first I thought Green Goblin got left behind with this update, initially because he didn't get an Awakening or T3, though I do expect that he will get one in the next week or so, but also because his kit seemed pretty empty and lacking effects. But after I did this initial test and saw how much damage he was doing, I actually paid a little bit closer attention to the patch notes and saw that his 5th skill actually gives him 100% increased damage buff, and his 4th skill gives him another 100% damage increase to the next skill. So in reality, even though he doesn't have damage accumulation in his kit, he has an even better effect, since that 100% damage increase buff is basically the full effect that you would get from damage accumulation, but you don't have to worry about filling up the effect constantly as it refreshes. And if you take into account that proc on the 4th skill, it's basically like you have a free CTP or obelisk proc on the character already. Meaning that if you do actually put something like a CTP of Destruction or an energy on the character, which you easily can because he is really proc friendly, then you can get up to 400% increased damage on that 4th skill. And if you go even further and use something like a CTP of Destruction with that strike effect, so the reforged CTP, then you can get up to 500% increased damage or 520% increased damage on boss enemies. In addition to this, the character also has healing on his 3rd skill, which is pretty interesting because the 3rd skill does no damage, but it does work pretty well with the idea that I said that he is very proc friendly, since you can activate that healing at any point and not mess up your damage proc. With the new uniform, I'm able to do 7 additional health bars of damage in the same time that I would have with the Iron Patriot uniform, and I'm able to complete stage 99 of Thanos in under 2 minutes. I also tested how the uniforms compare in World Boss Ultimate, since the Iron Patriot uniform has all defense down that ignores immunity, whereas the new uniform doesn't have any of that. With the old uniform, I was able to get down to the last 7 health bars in 1 minute of fighting. With the new uniform, however, even with no all defense down at all, I'm able to complete the entire fight in 1 minute of fighting. The rotation I use to achieve this is you use the 2nd skill, which you delay cancel after you see him throw those goblin bombs in the air. Then you go into your 5th skill, which you delay cancel after the camera kind of aims down a little bit. If you cancel it too early, then you'll miss out on all the damage from the 5th skill. And then after that, you simply stay in your 4th skill. If you need healing at any point, you can just use the 3rd skill or cancel it, and then just go back into the regular rotation. The 1st skill also does a considerable amount of damage, so it might be worth noting that a CTP of Rage could also potentially work pretty well on him. But keep in mind that he doesn't have that guaranteed crit rate, so proccing might be a little bit more problematic. Because Electro and Green Goblin are both speed villain types, that means that if you are in Vibranium League squad battle, this will be one of your fights, and these two characters are both now meta for that type restricted fight. Green Goblin provides the support, whereas Electro provides the leadership and the main damage. And you can see here that with no damage proc like before, I'm able to hit 7.2 million, which is crazy considering that with Bullseye with a CTP of Rage, I was only able to get somewhere around the 5.5 or 6 million mark. Meaning that if I went with a damage proc, such as a CTP of Judgment or a Mighty One, I should be able to hit that 8 million or 9 million mark. And for people that have a full build, possibly with Odin's and his artifact, they should be able to hit the 10 million mark or possibly even higher. For comparison, I also used Green Goblin in the last 3 minutes of the fight to see how high he would score with the destruction, and I was able to hit the 7.4 million mark, which I think is pretty impressive considering he's still only T2, and if or when he gets his T3 or Awakening, he should be just as viable for this restricted fight as Electro. Because these characters score so well, I wouldn't be surprised if either of them take over the speed villain day for ABX in the future. Funny enough, when I decided to test the characters in PvP, I found out that Electro has a 290% attack, defense, and HP increase in Challenger mode. So you obviously can't see how he really does, but you should get an idea of his rotation and the skills that he prioritizes and uses. So here are the hilarious results, but keep in mind that I actually took him into PvP at T2 before I awakened him. So it's actually quite funny to see a character at T2 with way more HP than those that are T3 and native tier 2s. I don't think I've really seen a character get an upgrade at the same time as they've been on the buff list for so long that they get a almost times 30 upgrade to all of their stats. So it's actually hilarious to me that the character can basically one-shot any of the characters in the game, even with his auto attacks. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention that the character also gets a 100% penetration chance, meaning that once that red bar fills up, it will knock the opponent out of their skills. But yeah, anyways, besides these buffs, the character can still struggle on some opponents, particularly ones like Spider-Man, who iframe a lot, and also have an iframe ignore. If you've paid attention to the AI's focus on these skills, you would have seen that the AI primarily goes into the 5th skill first, and then after it does the 5th skill, it goes into the 4th skill, which is actually pretty good for the character, since the 5th skill has a lot of damage and has that damage buff on it, and the 4th skill has 60% penetration to all sources, meaning that you can basically take out any opponent once you go into the 5-4 combo. The 3rd skill is also decent for providing some heal, though the AI generally doesn't use it. And in PvP, since the character doesn't really move around as much as in PvE, you don't get as much benefit from that damage accumulation bonus. You saw in those last clips that Electro did struggle a bit versus characters like Spider-Man and Doctor Doom that do iframe a lot, so I transcended him and took him into the same fights to see how he would perform now with higher stats, even more so than the ones from the buffs. But as you'll see, he definitely performs better because that Awakening skill provides him with another iframe ignore once he reaches that 30 seconds and it fills up, allowing him to take out those opponents that do iframe a lot. In terms of build recommendations, it's kind of hard to say until after timeline resets, and hopefully he isn't on the buff list so I can actually test him properly. But I would probably guess that something like CTP of Authority would work pretty well for him, since he can get some damage accumulation and extra survival, allowing him to reach that Awakening skill more often to take out those opponents with a lot of iframes. You could potentially also go with something like a CTP of Regen, since he does have that 35% healing and pretty decent base health on his kit, but he doesn't tend to use his 3rd skill very often, so that might not be as effective as you might hope. Both of those defensive options should work pretty well for him, considering that his base damage is pretty good, But if you want to go with more of a hybrid option, you could also opt for CTP of Greed, considering that he also has that 60% penetration to all sources on his 4th skill. His 5th skill has a pretty low cooldown and pretty decent skill priority, meaning that he can go into it pretty quickly and beat out the other opponent, meaning that a damage proc could potentially work pretty well for him. Both Doc Ock and Green Goblin don't really have the same tools in their kit as Electro, so their performance in PvP is a little bit more lacking. For Doc Ock, you can build him with something like CTP of Authority or Regen, and it should work decently for the majority of the roster, but versus some of the stronger metas, I would think that you would need a damage proc, since you probably won't have enough damage to take them out. Even though Doc Ock's base damage is good, a lot of his damage is dependent on the fact of him using that 3rd skill, which he doesn't necessarily do right away with his AI rotation, since he usually goes into the 5th skill first and then follows with the 4th skill and then the 3rd skill. For this reason, I've opted to go with his CTP of Destruction, and even though his survival is worse, his potential to take out some of the big meta or high health characters is a lot more consistent. As you saw in the previous clips, I was able to take out characters like Thanos, Jean, and even Mephisto, which he has a type disadvantage versus, and in this final clip I do the same thing, but this time I'm fighting characters that also don't have an iframe ignore, which allows him to actually work pretty well, considering that the 5th skill is a pretty decent iframe and the 4th skill has invincible on it. However, as you can see, he is still susceptible to reflect damage, and his main weakness is characters that iframe a lot. Similarly, Green Goblin is in the same boat, since he does struggle versus characters with a lot of iframes or iframe ignore. But even at T2, with the damage proc, he is able to take out some top meta characters like Thanos in one shot. He performs really well versus opponents that don't have iframe ignore, because he does have a bunch of iframes in his skills, and due to having good skill priority, he can go into them before the opponent, finishing them off before they do the same. Once he gets his Awakening or T3, it'll be a better judge of whether an Authority or Regen might be a better option for him. One thing to keep in mind though is that if he does get a good base health increase, a Regen could combo pretty well with the healing on the 3rd skill. Another possible benefit of going with a defensive build is that the character has more chance to go into the 3rd skill, which provides that fear CC effect to the rest of the opponents and provides a dodge increase to your allies, which could prove pretty useful in Alliance Conquest, especially versus teams that don't have a debuff leadership. If you want my opinion on which uniform to get first, I would probably say Electro, since he had the best performance overall, but if you don't have that character already, then I would say Doc Ock. One thing to keep in mind though is that Green Goblin might get his T3 or Awakening in the near future, and I kind of suspect that he's going to get a pretty amazing upgrade considering how good his base kit already is, at least in terms of damage. If you're still not sure, I would probably just wait till the anniversary anyway, since these uniforms are bound to get a 50% discount then. Also, I almost forgot to mention, but I don't know if it's an oversight or not, that Green Goblin doesn't have the Sinister 6 tag with his new uniform. I hope this is just an error and the devs notice and fix it with his potential T3. For the next video, I'll take a look and see what Mysterio can do now that he has an Awakening, as well as the remainder of the Sinister 6, even though it likely won't be too much. Anyways, that wraps it up for this video. If you enjoyed it and found the information useful, please consider liking and subscribing and sharing this with other people, since they might find it useful as well. And as always, thank you for your time and watching, but the video is now over.